Bom dia.
Good morning. Welcome again to Sesc Pompeia. Now we're going to start our third and last day of the international seminar, The Ends of Democracy, Populist Strategies, Scepticism Regarding Democracy, and the Search for Popular Sovereignty. This seminar is conducted by the International Consortium of Programs and Critical Theories with the funding of the Andrew W. Mellon and the Berkeley University in California. This seminar is a partnership between the Philosophy Department of the University of São Paulo and the Sesc, the Commerce Service of São Paulo. We are being broadcast in the internet, www.sesc.sp. And if you are in this room, you are allowed that your image is broadcasted as well. Those that have questions, please look for the production to sign your authorization for your image broadcast. If you want to leave, please use the upstairs exit. We want to thank your presence here and want to call on stage Natalia Brizuela.
Welcome, good morning.
Bem-vindos. Bom dia.
Professor Christian Dunker, who will be moderating this morning's panel. I just wanted to take a minute to thank enormously the 4 extraordinary sign language interpreters that have been with us for the past 2 days and today. Kiwal Gurgel, Kelly Gurgel, Roberta Teixeira, and Bruno Teixeira. And thank you so much for your work. So now Professor Christian Dunker is going to moderate the panel.
Bom dia. Eu gostaria de chamar, então, para...
Call on stage for the debate panel, Monique David-Ménard. She has had a double career. First, from 1999 and 2008, she was professor of philosophy and director of research at the University of Paris 7. And from 2005 to 2011, she was also the director of the Centre d'études du vivant, the Living Center of Studies, where she introduced the program Gender and Sexuality. She's now associate member at the ICI Berlin, and she's practicing of psychoanalysis in Paris. She's also an associate member of the Society of Psychoanalysis Freudian. She is a co-founder of the Society for Philosophy and Psychoanalysis, our SIP, and she's a member of the International Network of Women Philosophers at UNESCO. Her recent publications include Éloge des arts dans la vie sexuelle, Object, Exchange and Discourses, Dialogue on Psychoanalysis and Philosophy, Phantasm Objects, Life and Death, Anthropologie de sexualité, the injustificable philosophical rationality, and and an essay critique to the pure reason. So now I want to call on stage Monique.
Queria apresentar também
I also want to introduce Jimmy Casas Klausen, professor of the International Institute of the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and she's the co-editor of Contexto Internacional Journal of Global Connections. He teaches political theory, specializing in 20th century French philosophy, post-colonial theory, feminism, and queer theory. He's currently working on 2 research projects. The first on the recent prominence of anarcho-capitalism, right-wing anti-statism, and authoritarian populism, and anti-Semitic trends after colonization, and which has been subsidizing international policies of activism, also called uncontracted tribes in the Amazon and elsewhere. Past publications include Economies of Violence, the Bhagavad Gita, and The Fostering of Life in Gandhis, and Goose, Anti-Colonial Theories, Hannah Arendt and Anti-Primitivism, and Fugitive Rousseau. And several titles, he holds several degrees in anthropology from the University of Chicago and political science from the University of California, Berkeley. So I'd like to welcome Jimmy Casas Klausen.
O nosso debatedor será então Juan Obarrio.
Juan Obarrio is going to be our interlocutor. He's an associate professor of anthropology at the Hopkins University. He's the founding director of the program on the Global South at the University of San Martin, Buenos Aires. He serves on the advisory board of the Consortium of Humanities Center and Institutes. His areas of expertise are critical theory and political anthropology, with special focus on post-colonial studies and Southern theory. In addition to his research in South America and Southern Africa, he has worked on program building to foster South-South academic collaborations across regions and languages. He has received fellowships from the Institute for Advanced Studies and several other collaborations with South-South and other regions. He has received fellowships from the Institute of Advanced Study, MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, and the Social Science Research Council in Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy. He is the author of The Spirit of the Laws, The Matter of Time, and the Spirit of the Laws in Mozambique. He's co-author of Post-Colonial Memories, an essay on the crisis called Future Africans, and Emergency and Possibilities. He's the editor of the journal Critical Times, Interventions in Global Critical Theory, and he has which is published by the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs, which subsidize our meeting here today. So, welcome Juan Obarrio.
Vamos ouvir então, primeiramente, a
first of all, let's listen to
Monique,
the speech by Monique. Monique, be welcome.
Thank you so much for organizing this event, and it's something very, very important in our times for multiple reasons. And as we see, and I spoke on that with Christian Dunker just before, in politics, there are not only rational struggles, but he said here, for example, savage rituals who happened just at the opening of our Congress. And I will speak on these unrational or savage dimension of politics. Unrational, I am not sure, because they have a logic, but not the logic of our democratic exchanges of argument. In philosophy, this is related perhaps with the problem of the unconditionality of changes. I was thinking on that question yesterday in the discussion between Wendy and Vladimir. That is to say, Vladimir said that we must, under what condition can the phenomenon, it's a quotation from Vladimir, under what condition can the phenomenon of generalized disidentification in the socio-political field occur? My question is, must we inscribe in our program generalized disidentification? My paper is on property, and property is an interesting institution because there is in property a subjective dimension and also a sociopolitical dimension. But property doesn't organize a generalized. If we touch property in our society, what will be changed? I think that the traditional problem, property of the mean of production and private property, is not enough to think, to analyze, and to take in account this savage dimension of our social life and subjective life. So I do agree that the problem of disidentification is very important if we will change some important things in our societies, but generalized disidentification seems to me too unconditioned in the sense of Kant, and participating in a confusion between two meaning of universality and totality. Do we not have a too narrowly rationalist conception of political struggles? I will try to grasp this anemic layer of socio-political existence by way of three formulations. One, the philosophy of abstract right in Hegel. Second, the animism of the unconscious in Freud. And third, the comparison made by an anthropologist, Marilyn Strathern, between the role of mask statues in New Ireland and patent right and intellectual property in modern society. The question is, how do political struggles in democracy put into play animistic components of social relation. And how can we take this in account in an emancipatory perspective? Hegel. Property, in Hegel, puts in relation wills and things. It is a social relation which, curiously, is founded metaphysically upon the inanimate. Things mediate social relation, and in particular, the violence of this relation, he said. Things mediate social relation. This is clear in Phenomenology of Spirit and also in 1821, in the last book of Hegel before he died, Philosophy of Right, lesson introducing a philosophy of right. To be a property owner is to affirm that a thing is mine. Heterogeneous to a will of which it is deprived, the thing is nonetheless what the will is identified with in a paradoxical act. The initiative of the will is realized by negating itself, and this liberty finds, due to this, materiality and limits. It is a matter of an Entäußerung of the will, a term which is often translated as alienation and sometimes by two terms in French or in English, extériorisation and expression. Jean-François Kervégan utilizes two terms sometimes. The will gives itself reality and negates itself by identifying itself with the thing. It is this affirmed identity with the thing, metaphysically different than the self, that sounds like animism. Not because the thing would be endowed with a soul, precisely not, but because the will inhibits it in some way. I would like to risk at the outset a suggestive and unexpected convergence with anthropologists. Without rushing into things, let us nonetheless note that Stratton, in particular, compares the rituals of transmission linked to ritual masks in New Orleans, the Malagan, to patent rights in what he called Euro-Americans, a combination of technology and intellectual property rights. Hegel distinguishes ownership, that is to say the fact of being established somewhere, from property properly speaking, and from taking possession. Property, Eigentum, is the juridical act that establishes an exclusive relation between will and thing. And we hear from the beginning that property has to do with identity, because Eigen, it's the German term who designates identity. The polysemy of the term is ceaselessly invoked by Hegel. Eigen, characteristic, Eigentum, Eigentümlichkeit, the sense is specific quality, singularity, we can say. The taking possession is the fact of making something one's own by making use of a thing of which we are juridically the owner. It's the moment of the right, he said. The heterogeneity between will and thing that gives content and limit to the will is the criteria that Hegel uses to differentiate what can take the juridical form of property and what cannot. So Marx, naturally, read Hegel very carefully. I cannot reduce my neighbor to the state of a beast of burden, since his living being, for my will, does not have the same exteriority as the exteriority that links my will to such a thing. But I can be stoic, by contrast, distancing myself from my body, that is to say, declaring and rendering effective the fact that my body and the chain that imprison it are not me as will. Hegel thus critiques, for example, certain judicial document of Roman law. If we were to admit that a juridical person can be a property owner, while all usage of the thing would be the prerogative of another, we would be dealing with, he said, a madness of personality, of juridical personality. And for the same reason, it justifies that anybody can have good without masters at their disposal. He takes many examples, and therefore it's interesting. Public monument, because masterless, if the state does not do anything about them. That is to say, if it does not materialize itself by the social and political use it makes of them. Inversely, there are things that exist whose reality is to reach to concrete or to spiritual, that is proper equivalent by Hegel, to be able to take the form of this paradoxical link between will and thing. Such is the case with the work of writers or artists. Their family would like to reduce them to private property, but it becomes masterless for a reason opposite to the one that intervenes in the case of public monument. Their content becomes universal and thus no longer has the limited character of a thing. So, the exteriority and the limitation of the thing is also the reason for which Hegel excludes slavery, servitude, alienation of religion, intelligence, from the ethical sense in the service of another will. So, I read this text in a perspective where the interest of this analysis is to determine the limits of the rights. For example, property right. This does not mean that intellectual property rights doesn't exist. It means that it always fails partially, which is manifested regularly in conflicts concerning the heritage of work. By contrast, right indeed succeeds in regulating the reproduction of invention and works by technology that makes of produced things so many copies of the original works. The printed allows a work to circulate in a way completely independent of the creative will, and this materiality wholly justifies that the circulation of works fall under jurisdiction of property law, for example. And another example, naturally, more than an example, there is something in organic or social things that make of them more than simply things enclosed in the juridical form. The activity immanent to right as the active putting in form of social relation fails, since the starting matrix, the face-to-face between will and thing, encounters its limit. This is what abstract right means. This is also the case when Hegel analyzes contracts and economic exchange. Economic exchange is an insufficient form to give a form and social relation. But it exists, but there is an au-delà, a behind. Property rights, by their very insufficiency, locate, or indicate more concrete and complex form of social production. In Lacanian term, this had to do with the impossible. It's the failure who indicate what is out of the form. Or the debate over thing in property right is useful because of its relative impotency. And therefore, property rights situate the density of social relations. Secondly, the animism of the unconscious, according to Freud. Must we qualify abstract right as animistic? By qualifying as animistic the relation to thing in property, I am making a somewhat peculiar use of this term. And there is a so in my problematic, but be a little patient. By qualifying, animism is defined traditionally as the attribution of a soul to plants, animal, and inanimate objects, for example, in totemism. Totemism is just one example or model of animism. Now, I said at the beginning that the equation established by Hegel between will and thing is paradoxical. The inanimate matter of the thing is posed as heterogeneous to the spirit that comes to be the possessor. The complexity of these moments of exteriorization and becoming other to oneself in things, even though it is the will that it is supposed to render itself strange to itself by this alienation, does not correspond to the immediacy of what gives itself as the soul of things and being. On the other hand, it is useful to refer the definition that Philippe Descola, following Eduardo Viveros de Castro, gives to animism as a mode of identification. That is to say, as establishing relations who are not at the beginning related with the difference between nature and culture. Animism establishes an identity of interiority between humans and non-humans, and a non-identity in physicality, that is to say, in bodies. For Europeans, the reality of bodies goes without saying. The question that polarizes our thought is that of knowing to which body a soul is to be attributed and which body. Those of sauvage, primitive, slaves, animal, and therefore the Catholic Church in the expedition in the time of colonialism have in their luggage, and more than luggage, priesthood. They had to determine if the people have or didn't have a soul. But for non-modern, the question is not posed in these terms. Bodies are anything but evident in their reality. This is why encountering bodies is an ordeal that persists throughout life, and what Viveros de Castro called metaphysique cannibalistic metaphysic, had to do with these multiple and very subtle encounters with bodies who aren't evident in their reality. And then they think these experiences by way of the theme of declining predation of multiple manners of which us, Europeans, have no idea. The question of the attribution of the soul to beings with the relation are bound up is not posed as a belief to which one must adhere, that one would be able to adopt. No, it is exactly matter of classificatory system, like the savage mind in Lévi-Strauss, which still presupposes the validity of the distinction between nature and culture. Animism is structure thinking that puts existence into form by a general schema that is independent of our category. For example, this scheme of predation. It's very different from Hegel, but however, the common point between Hegel and animism redefined by De Castro and Descola is that the latter is neither a belief nor a classificatory system, but a thinking, a metaphysics. This is the equation to come to Freud. The term used by Vivero de Castro in order to characterize animism is, as I said above, that of modes of identification. Now it is precisely this term, as distinct thus from the term comprehension and sensation and perception, that we find in Freud when he establishes a proximity between the unconscious and animism. In the text, the unconscious, 1915. We all read that text. But the end of the first paragraph sounds strange. When Freud justifies the hypothesis of the unconscious, he begins by distinguishing the type of knowledge contained in the unconscious phenomena of all knowledge in the philosophical and psychological sense of the term. Symptom, dreams, parapraxis, and, he said, post-hypnotic suggestion are deployed at once in acts and in the discourse maintained by the subject, but without this subject mastering through knowledge this manifestation. It is this non-mastery, as opposed to Cartesian consciousness, that what defined as the guarantor of the truth of the idea that Freud names unconscious. So the unconscious is not a non-conscious self-knowledge, he said, not a cognition, but rather an identification. This, I quote two passages from Freud. When he say, I prefer the term identification to the term knowledge, unconscious knowledge. Unconscious is incompatible with knowledge. He writes, I would no doubt be psychologically more correct to put it this way, that without any special reflection, ohne besondere Überlegung, we attribute to everyone else our own constitution and therefore our consciousness as well. And that this identification is a sine qua non of our understanding. This deduction, or better, this identification, was formally extended by the ego to other human beings, to animals, to plants, inanimate objects, and to the world at large, and proved serviceable so long as their similarity to the individual ego was overwhelming greed. But it became impossible to abandon or indispensable. The German term is unverlässlich, in proportion as the difference between the ego and these other widened. Thus, the animistic mechanism of identification is just as impossible to abandon as it is for it to no longer be only on the other human being. However, when we civilized attribute a consciousness to other men, we, in the same time, misrecognize its immediate character. That is something magic or unconscious. We think and we say, for example, Descartes, that it is a deduction. I will not reread the metaphysical meditation, the second metaphysical meditation, but Descartes said the certainty of the existence of the other is a deduction. So we, modern, we are so distant from animistic thought that we misrecognize its efficacy precisely where it is exercised unflinchingly, the unconscious. Only with great difficulty do we have access to our nonetheless active savagery. Freud's definition of the unconscious, yes, but it's also completed by a reference to Kant, to the difference between subject and object, and to the limit of this face-to-face, because there is an unknowable thing in itself who modifies the relation between subject and object. And then this is important because rather than to speak of interiority in this complex relation between the three terms, it would be best to say that it is a polarization by the unknown that divides the soul. The relation between, Freud said, Kant is very useful, it's a phantasmatic Kant or a very simple Kant, but what he kept in Kant is that between subject and object, there is a division, and this division has two forms. The second form is the unknowable of the things himself. Also, I think that what is interesting there for Freud is the split in the subject. Conclusion, second quotation. The psychoanalytic assumption of unconscious mental activity appears to us, on the one hand, as a further expansion. It's not a rest of animism, it's a further expansion of the primitive animism, which caused us to see copies of our own consciousness all around us, and on the other hand, as an extension of the corrections undertaken by Kant of our views or on external perception. In Freud, as in Hegel, the animate and inanimate are put on the same level. But Hegel insists on the metaphysical heterogeneity of the inanimate thing with respect to the initiative of the will. However, the proprietary will is not conformed with the object, whereas Freud describes a kind of back and forth in which, as soon as the intellectualist pretension of consciousness is developed, it is at the price of what falls under, even for consciousness, identification as in conscious identity with the other, the stranger. One more word on Freud, and then we shift with Stratham. In Freud, exteriority intervenes in another domain than that kind of space. It still has a relation with the object, but as that which is excluded from itself. It is in the movement of misrecognition of consciousness that no longer has access to its own activity, this animism of consciousness, of identification, that an exteriority appears, and in so doing appears as an offshoot of a radical exteriority of the object, of the thing, in the Lacanian sense. Understanding only returns to what it excluded by transforming the excluded into an object of judging. When in 1920, Freud names negation the radical affinity of the intellectual act of judging and the exclusion from the self of something that subject attributes to another, the analyst in the case, he develops this theme of a struggle constitutive of the subject, a split and the struggle. Is it so different that the cannibal metaphysics conceived by Vivero de Castro? Can we bring together exclusion, Verwerfung, and predation? That would be my question. And naturally, this question has to do with my anthropologist readings. Otherwise, I never had such a curious idea. The object described by Marvin Strater under the name Malagans condense mourning rituals, the transmission of goods and capacity to the one who has left life on earth, and the invention of a new social relation between the group and these who pretend to give a pathway to the dead person transformed into ancestry. A dead person is not immediately an ancestry. There is a long process to make an ancestry with that person. And it's the equivalent of our right of property, this delay, she said. These statues or these masks, which appear to us as composites, serve first of all to give a body to the one who has just passed away. When a member of a group dies, they must be given a body, or they said, or a skin, so that they can become the ancestor of other bodies present who will inherit their capacities, goods, and talent. Such a mask, for example, possesses the general appearance of a head, but upon which are posed numerous small sculptures of snakes, birds, fish, or the wings of a parrot. What is important here, said Stratton, is that we neither know the background nor which bodies are fixed upon which background. Our sense of space is totally in trouble. This is the first point that Stratton treats, since it subverts the distinction between depth and surface, and thus also the distinction between interior and exterior, both of which shape our conception of space. This descriptive visual character requires, according to Stratton, a conception of inhabitation that ignores our distinction between nature and mind, as well as our pretension to master our technology and our knowledges. We indeed believe to stand over and against nature, and we believe that our technology accentuates this position. Property rights sanctions it by making believe, by the politic of patent, in the distinction between nature and technology. Nature, indeed, in Euro-American society, is what cannot be patented. This is why the Malagans are puzzling. We do not know what is enveloping what when we see them. It is a subtle invention that say that our ancestors indeed inhabit us as much as we succeed them when we prepare a body or a skin for them. Thus, this technique of fabrication of Malagan equally defies our conception of time. Christian, do I have how many minutes? Okay. On one hand, it might take many years before people that claim to have a right to carry on with what deceased person was or did materialize that which links them to this death by inventing a statue. And that is for me interesting in comparison with our status of property. On the other hand, this technique is also an institution that we will qualify as cultural. Those aspiring to a succession are not alone. They appeal to a sculptor to whom they express the idea of what links them to the one who is not yet an ancestor. It is the artist that gives form to their idea. Finally, the time of transmutation of capacities of the deceased contained in the fabricated object is paradoxical with respect to our modern customs, since the Malagan is not built to last, but to be destroyed, contrary to our technical object. When the mask has united in it all of the capacities of the dead, and they are transferred to other members of the group, when this object has fulfilled its function, it is destroyed. Stratton notes humorously that the inhabitant of New Ireland quickly learned that one way to abandon the Malagans to sell them to Europeans and Americans, who would put them on display in museums. Also we see the Malagan, but the New Islander destroyed the Malagan. So the Decades also produce no relation of exchange due to this sale. The New Irelanders do not ignore the distinction between interior and exterior, but they make a totally other use of it than we do in our technique and our rights of inheritance. So, conception of space, conception of time, conception of property, and conception of subjective identity go together, she will show. And she asked, what is then so distinctive in the functioning of this power of inheritance that must be placed in a body before being able to liberate it? And since exteriority is not any less natural, the anthropologist poses the same question to modern and non-moderns. I quote, how do we separate ourselves from what we produce? The New end of quote. The New Irelanders materialize a provisional new body for a deceased person and abandon it as soon as it has served to redefine social capacity. So, I come to my conclusion. The idea that the very basis of the political philosophies of democracy carry along illusion is not new. I have attempted here to assess the decentering that anthropology has as its goal. The decentering is a different there are two decenterings. The one of the yes, it's a different manner than the one of the critical theory, which said that our rationality is irrationality. I read recently because Vladimir said we must reread Marcuse. So I read the one-dimensional man. And he said, there is an irrationality of the reason. I think we must never think in that manner in order to change our reality. The Malagan aren't less rational than rights of property. We must invent other categories, as Viveros de Castro and Philippe Diescola made. In what way might the institution of Malagan in New Ireland challenge the distinction between public-private, space-time, identity? What is indeed interesting in this example is that mourning rituals and the repartition of new social capacities do not isolate individuals as in our democratic practices and ideologies. The debates around the private or public appropriation of the means of production led unprecedented possibilities for the putting in relation of things and social and the sociality of the relation escape. In the same way, the distinction between animate and inanimate, decisive in philosophy of property, is challenged by this counter-example. Or again, we can get a better handle on how the structure of the social time is modeled by practices and rituals. The delay, often long, that follows before the common initiative of a person linked to the deceased and of a sculptor to whom the former recounts their idea, takes on the provisional form of a statue of Marx, etc. That is to say that, contrary to what happens in our societies, the relation of individuals' wills to things is not isolated. Things are indissociable from social relation. So I can stop here.
Thank you, Monique. Vamos ouvir agora Jimmy Casas Klausen.
Obrigado. Good morning. I want to thank this time the audience because I know that some of you have been here for more than one day. So I'm going to be talking about constitutive masochism, and I guess I should thank you for your masochism. My epigraph is from Sigmund Freud, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. In our unconscious, we daily and hourly get rid of anyone who stands in our way. Our unconscious will murder even for trifles. The ends of democracy will recall for some of those present here the ends of man. The pronouncement in their very different ways by Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault of the limits of anthropologism, whether in the modern arrangement of human knowledge or in the thinking of being in the long history of metaphysics. For Foucault and Derrida, the exhaustion of European humanism was a global concern. For if certain developments of European humanism, above all ethnology, reproduced ethnocentrism in the very gesture of exposing it, then the exhaustion and end of man might then finally allow for the displacement or decentering of Europe and its Atlantic brethren. Yet there was another rather different end of man announced around the same time, also global in its concern. 3 years after Foucault published The Order of Things, and mere months after Derrida delivered the lecture, The Ends of Man, Norman Lewis stirred consciences globally in 1969 with the publication of his article, Genocide, which detailed atrocities against Brazilian Indians. Genocide was published in London's Sunday Times magazine, but was reprinted in other media outlets internationally. It also led to the founding of the NGO Survival International, which campaigns globally on behalf of tribal peoples. Lewis drew his evidence for atrocities from the report of an internal parliamentary investigation of the Indian Protection Service's irregularities during Brazil's civil military dictatorship. The report told over the course of its 5,000 pages of outright violent extermination of villages, poisoning of food supplies, deliberate infection with smallpox, rape, coerced prostitution, physical and psychological torture, and slavery. In most cases, these atrocities were committed by big landowners and their paramilitary forces. Sometimes Indian Protection Service functionaries abetted the atrocities. In any case, they did not avert them. Moreover, the report exposed widespread corruption by agents who either economically exploited the Indians whom they were supposed to protect, stole Indian patrimony, or diverted agency funds. Lewis's article makes it clear that the pacification policies for Brazil's Indians were the first step towards their extinction. Moreover, FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, which replaced the Indian Protection Service, was unlikely to fulfill its task, since it was and continues to be underfunded and also lacked political support. Consequently, according to Lewis, even flight, evasion, the final outlet left to Indians, no longer could provide them security. It used to be the case, Lewis reports, that tribes could resist destruction through isolation. For 400 years, such tactical nomadism served them well, until now. Unprotected, isolated Indians, so far beyond the reach of the Brazilian state, could be exterminated in the frontier vastnesses where commercial mega-interests call the shots, and nobody would know of their living or dying. Unsurprisingly then, Lewis ends on an even more pessimistic note. He cites a gloomy prediction by the anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro, who, quote, calculated that in accordance with a survey of data collected over the past 50 years, there would not be a single Indian left alive in Brazil in 1980, end quote. Flash forward to 1996. Through the work of its Department of Isolated Tribes, and especially the efforts of its director, Sidney Passuelo, Brazil's FUNAI has created an indigenous reserve named Massacó on behalf of an uncontacted tribe, a povo isolado. Calling it a landmark to demarcate a reserve without having made any prior direct contact with its beneficiaries, Passuelo stated proudly, quote, "This is the first Indian territory in Brazil to be demarcated without our knowing anything about the group. We don't know their name, their language, or how many there are. It is not important to know them or study them. What is important is to guarantee their survival," end quote. Massacó, though established in 1996, was the fruit of an indigenous policy reversal led by Passuelo in 1987, during the transition to civilian government in Brazil, and made viable by the new 1988 Constitution. This active unknowing that Passuelo mentions is profound. To recall Foucault, we could say that the policy for uncontacted tribes is driven by a biopolitics that works against the will to knowledge. For it is not only that we do not know who the uncontacted are, it is also that they do not know that we guarantee their survival. As Passuelo judged of an expedition that he had led in 2002, quote, "Our work here is beautiful because they don't even know that we're here to help them," end quote. But also, it's the case that we owe them something other than an unknown, anonymous death. As FUNAI agent José Carlos Mireles noted on an expedition, the danger of unsecured isolation, quote, "is the same as killing a mosquito, isn't it? Something that can disappear at any moment. Their future no longer depends on them, it depends on us," end quote. There is much worth saying about the politics of so-called uncontacted tribes. For example, its invocation of a kind of cheap Rousseauian image of noble savages. Here, though, I want to focus on the relationship between democracy, the unknown or indeterminate, and death. How might we understand this situation in relation to democracy? The situation described as follows. We aim to prohibit the genocide of a group of people living among us who nevertheless remain unknown to us and who do not know that their survival depends on us, yet whose murder might occur unknown to us were it to happen. If democracy minimally connotes, in Wendy Brown's words, quote, "political self-rule by the people, whoever the people are," and if modern institutional democracy is historically linked to the emergence of popular sovereignty and the rule of law, then political self-rule by the people, whoever the people are, might entail a principle whereby the people, and not someone else or some non-human power, have granted or would have granted political legitimacy to a norm, and that the prescription that they attach to the norm must subject them generally, neither targeting nor exempting anyone in particular. Democracy's self-rule then seems simple. We, the people, rule ourselves. We legitimate our rule as normative standard. We are subjected to rules as laws, which we prescribe ourselves. However, this simplicity is only apparent, as Jean-François Lyotard explains. Quote, "The normative phrase is we the French people." He's describing, obviously, French democracy. "We the French people decree as a norm that, etc." The prescriptive phrase is we the French people ought to carry out Act A. But the two we's do not occupy the same position in each of the two phrases. In the normative, the we is the addressor of the norm. In the prescriptive, it is the addressee of the obligation. The proper name, the French people, masks this displacement, as does the we. One may make the law and submit to it, Lyotard concludes, but not in the same place, that is, not in the same phrase, end quote. According to Lyotard, democracy as self-rule needs to be analyzed as two separate instances. The self-reflexive rule of we the people masks two different relations, normative and prescriptive, which involve two different language games. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the only classical theorist who drew attention to this duplicity. In The Social Contract, Rousseau names the members of a body politic citizens when they are active and subjects when they are passive. Hence, according to him, citizens rule subjects. Subjects are ruled by citizens. Even though the relations involve exactly the same persons, the positions and effects of these two relations are distinct. Similarly, sovereign, he insists, designates the body politic when it is active, and state is its name when it is passive. Rousseau's usage may seem counterintuitive to our current imaginary of the state, which figures states as highly active. However, when we refer to state violence against a group of people, Rousseau is suggesting that it would be more accurate to say that the sovereign commands the state to kill. For this reason, Rousseau would actually find the term state sovereignty highly confusing. It is easier to see what Rousseau means in the case of authoritarianism. The sovereign military dictators commanded state forces to kill. It seems strange or offensive, however, to say of a democracy, we command us to kill. Despite their analytical insight, Lyotard and Rousseau analyzed democratic self-rule too neatly by distributing the reflexive action, we rule ourselves, into addressor and addressee, agent and patient, we rule us, and we are ruled by us. Rousseau's text hints at a symptomatic residue or remainder in such an analysis when he states that the members of the body politic collectively assume the name people, yet Rousseau neither calls this people active or passive, nor designates a counterpart to it. Might we conclude then that thinking of democracy's self-rule as a reflexive action comprising two separate positions obscures something crucial? What effects might be revealed if we were to discuss self-rule by the people, neither in the active voice nor in the passive voice, nor in reflexive verbal usage, but rather in the middle voice? Even if, in the classical Greek language to which we owe the word democracy, the middle voice is often used for reflexive actions, and even if Freud equated the reflexive and middle voice in the essay A Child is Being Beaten, there is a persuasive psychoanalytic argument for differentiating them rigorously. As Jean Laplanche argues in Life and Death in Psychoanalysis, quote, there is every reason to distinguish the middle from the reflexive form within the structure of fantasy. Just as they are quite distinct grammatically and semantically, even if the form of their expression is occasionally identical, the reflexive form distinguishes more clearly the subject and the object of the action, allowing fantasized exchanges of position to take place. In the middle form, the terms of the fantasy remain in something of a state of coalescence, end quote. Laplanche gives the example of knocking oneself against something. Someone could deliberately knock herself into a table in order, for example, to get the attention of someone seated there. Or one could knock into it unintentionally or with indeterminate agency, including a supposedly pure accident. With the reflexive form, it is possible to identify and take up positions within a real or fantasized action. Even if the agent and patient are identical, it is possible to emphasize one or the other position. In the middle voice, agency and patiency remain indeterminate. So my question here is, are there fantasies of death and killing in the middle voice? The entire part of the differend in which Lyotard scrutinizes this disjuncture between the normative and the prescriptive modes of democratic self-rule is devoted to an exploration of speculative thought oriented by Theodor Adorno's Meditations on the Ends of Philosophy After Auschwitz. Lyotard notes that the we in which legislating citizens and obligated subjects supposedly coincides reaches the height of disjunction, quote, when the obligation made to the addressee is that he or she die, end quote. Certainly public authorities can and do command subjects to die. rather than, for example, to betray some other obligation, such as civic duty or freedom or martial glory. Quote, Lyotard again, "The reason to die always forms the bond of a we," end quote. Hence, the ideal of the beautiful death, kalos thanatos, in ancient Athens, would suture the disjuncture that threatens this we. We command us to die rather than to do X, and we do die. Auschwitz, however, forbids the beautiful death because the SS authorities present the deportee without any alternative. This is because the SS authorities exclude the deportee in advance from participating in any possible legitimating we. Hence, the command is not that some of us die because we'd legitimately decree it, with the result that the we will outlive the loss of some of us. Rather, the command from the perspective of the SS is that they die, we decree it. And from the perspective of the deportee, it is that we die, they decree it. Hence, Lyotard states, quote, "Dispersion is at its height. Our law kills them who have no relevance to it. Our death is due to their law, to which we owe nothing. Delegitimation is complete," end quote. Genocide kills in such a way that no one remains among the people to eternalize its name. And so death also is killed. And that is what is worse than death, Lyotard reflects. By violently foreclosing beautiful death and killing all the members of the we, who might remember that there was no alternative, genocide potentially renders murder unknown. In the case of the povos isolados, what Lyotard refers to as complete delegitimation may occur for reasons completely different than those at Auschwitz. The most obvious differences are, first, that most povos isolados, such as those in Brazil and India, reside in democratic rather than fascist authoritarian states. And second, that they do not participate with us in normative legitimation, not because we exclude them in advance, but because they wish to remain unknowable to us. If some of us threaten them with genocide, even without commanding or being commanded to do so by fascist authoritarian sovereign power, then what motivates this desire on the part of some of us to do so? Some of us, by the way, is potentially all of us. As Freud maintained, in our unconscious, we constantly murder for the pettiest of reasons. What democratic fantasies of death and killing are then repressed? In Life and Death and Psychoanalysis, Laplanche concludes that three entities emerge simultaneously and are co-constitutive: the unconscious, fantasy in the form of a previously non-sexual outward-directed aggression that is then turned around onto the self and introjected, and finally, third, sexuality in the form of masochistic excitation. Laplanche argues that reflexive masochism is primary. That is to say, all other sexuality, including active sadism and masochism, derives, according to him, from an original position of autoerotism, that is, autoaggression. Here, though, I want to focus on how Laplanche maps Freud's analysis in A Child is Being Beaten onto a diagram of the derivation of sadomasochistic sexuality. Let us recall first the situation in the essay A Child is Being Beaten. Freud remarks that he has frequently come across persons who have indulged in sexual pleasure, and then later strong guilt, around a stubbornly indeterminate fantasy of a child being beaten. Upon investigation, Freud deduces that there are three phases in the development of the beating fantasy. First, my father is beating the child whom I hate. Second, I am being beaten by my father. And then third, a child is being beaten. Phase 3 is admitted during analysis. Phase 2 can only be reconstructed by reference to the other phases because it is the original fantasy that is deeply repressed in the unconscious and inaccessible. Phase 1 is consciously recalled, though sometimes with difficulty, and is based on real scenes of adult punishment witnessed by the person. Hence, whereas phase 1 is a composite of real recollections, phase 2 is the unconscious fantasy, and phase 3 is the version of the fantasy as represented to consciousness. What might we reveal about death, killing, and the democratic self-rule of we the people if we transpose Laplanche's schema onto the situation of povos isolados, uncontacted tribes? Obviously, one must proceed with caution here, since the people does not have a psyche. Certainly, individuals do activate unconscious drives in one another when they form a we the people, and their desires may be broadly similar, but such collective activations are not equivalent to a unitary collective unconscious. My transposition of Laplanche and Freud here does nothing more than to illuminate allegorically a real historical political situation in a spirit similar to the one that inspired Gayatri Spivak in Can the Subaltern Speak when she precipitated the phrase, white men are saving brown women from brown men. Let us start, as Freud does, with the conscious but determinate fantasy. A people is being killed. Both Mireles and Pozuelo intended, of course, to prevent povos isolados from being killed. But the sentence, a people is being killed, describes what precisely motivated their work, and also what stimulates them to take such pride and pleasure in the survival they would secure for these uncontacted tribes. All the other sentences of this allegorical fantasy complex place we, as in we the people, in the position of the subject. Strictly speaking, a people is being killed is the most indeterminate of the sentences, and the one that functions most like an utterance in the middle voice, because it is not clear which people is being killed, nor what agent does the killing. However, all of the we sentences in this fantasy complex suffer the indeterminacy I explored earlier. Namely, it will remain unclear whether we prescribe or legitimate the actions in question, whether we act as sovereign or whether we act as state, whether we are citizens or whether we are subjects. Like phase 1 in A Child is Being Beaten, we are killing the people that we hate refers to memories, in this case, public memories of historical events, such as those recounted in Lewis's article, Genocide. Strictly speaking, in the composite fantasy that Freud explores, there are 3 personages involved: father, ego, and another child. Yet, as Laplanche points out, from the standpoint of a heteroaggressive drive for self-preservation, it is immaterial whether ego or another agent gets rid of the impediment. So, my father is beating the child whom I hate, and I am being beaten by my father, can be replaced by I am beating the child whom I hate, and I am being beaten by myself, respectively. And these in turn can be replaced by we are killing the people that we hate. We are being killed by ourselves, respectively. This last sentence in the real unconscious fantasy, this last sentence is the real unconscious fantasy totally repressed. For the moment, I want to leave it suspended, as I want to focus first on the sadistic and masochistic determinations of this indeterminate sentence. Recall that Lyotard and Rousseau registered the fact that we rule ourselves obscures a split, a real split, between we rule and we are ruled, between the position of normative legitimation and that of prescriptive obligation. Similarly, the reflexive action we are being killed by ourselves can be distributed into the actions we are killing and we are being killed. The object of these actions is someone else, another people. If we take Freud's essay, Drives and Their Vicissitudes, as a similarly fruitful exploration of the split between agency and patiency that Lyotard and Rousseau analyzed, then we make note of the following. Just as sadism and masochism represent the vicissitudes of sexuality as primary masochism, so likewise do ruling and being ruled represent the vicissitudes of democracy, and killing and being killed the vicissitudes of democratic fantasies of death. Now, we have already encountered the conscious fantasy we are being killed. This sentence describes the masochism of kalos thanatos, the beautiful death, the idea that a subset of we the people dies for us rather than betrays a political obligation constitutive of the we, and that this part of we This part of the we takes pleasure in this dying. Despite this civic optimism, though, we are being killed expresses an indeterminacy. Since there is a structural disidentification at the center of democratic self-rule between norm and prescription and between sovereign and state, it is always possible that this idea of the beautiful death may be a cynical ploy by the sovereign imposed on the state, an action distributed unequally between some citizens onto other subjects in the name of unifying a we. Or at the very least, it marks an irreducible ambivalence in democracy toward mortal sacrifice. The sadistic position within the fantasy complex is no less indeterminate. Which we kills and which wants to kill? The normative we or the prescriptive we? The we that legitimates or the we that is obligated? Do rogue subjects kill because citizens want it, even if they have not explicitly commanded this killing? Or do citizens command it while subjects, though reluctant, nevertheless obey? Is it the sovereign that really orders an obedient state apparatus to kill young Afro-Brazilian men in favelas? Or is it a murderous state that compels an unwilling sovereign to condone this killing? Or is it complicity between the two positions, a complicity that moreover each can plausibly deny as the other's bloodlust, not its own? It is within this indeterminacy that we can make sense of the genocidal effects of authoritarian populism. I think we may understand these effects, I think we may understand them as effects of quite determinate sadistic urges whose location in the we remains indeterminate. In his dazzling study of Thatcherism's populist politics, Stuart Hall defines authoritarian populism as the grounding of an effectively authoritarian political program in an appeal to the people. I quote Stuart Hall, quote, "The people must be mobilized, yet in order to prevent a populist mobilization from developing into a genuinely popular campaign," and he distinguishes between populist and popular, "the arousal of populist sentiment must be cut off at just the correct moment and subsumed or transformed into the identification with authority, the values of traditionalism, and the smack of firm leadership," end quote. Thatcherism appealed to traditional values that are familiar to our present times: empire, gender and sexual normativity, militarism, and a clamor for law and order that is sometimes explicitly racist. Hall's analysis therefore seems prescient, yet his conception of authoritarian populism may distribute positions too neatly and allocate agency only to one side. Citizens only exist to elect the sovereign, in this case a political party's operatives, in a campaign that manipulates subjects' worries, and then after the election, the citizens remain mostly inert subjects. However, in the case of Brazil today, the act of sadism that kills or threatens to kill queer or trans persons because they offend gender and sexual normativity, or Afro-descendant young men because they transgress a supposed law and social order, such instances of sadism are not clearly located only in the supposedly active positions of sovereign or citizens, but also in those supposedly passive subject positions of state and subjects. Indians are threatened under the current illegitimate regime not because Temer's coalition inhabits the position of sovereign, but because there is a sense indeterminately distributed among citizens and subjects and within the sovereign state. There is a sense that Indian claims for land far exceed their proportion of the population, that they have received beneficial unequal treatment, and that they therefore impede that supposedly should benefit and unify all members anew by the restored influence by ego preservers, however, prop up a true genocidal sadism that is more than a mere struggle for self-preservation. But it is important to make this claim cautiously. To argue that we are killing is located in the position reserved for sexual sadism within the fantasy complex is not the same as saying either that all sexual sadists are potentially genocidal, nor is it equivalent to saying that people who kill Brazilian Indians and who sometimes boast of doing so are sadists in their sexual lives. The sadist's pleasure with a masochist is indefinite sustainable because their bodies recuperate their forces. Killing, after all, is a completely different action than beating someone for pleasure. Killing is final. What then about the core repressed unconscious fantasy that sustains the entire complex? How exactly does the sentence, "we are being killed by ourselves," describe a democratic fantasy? In an exquisite passage in the 5th section of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, written in the wake of what was judged to be a near end of humanity in the Great War, Freud struggling to think through and name a tendency of all organic matter to return to an original and earlier resting point in inorganic existence, Freud speculates that life, living, might be none other than a Baroque series of detours on the way to death. But this raises a question. If each organism saves itself only for death, then why might it not simply succumb to the first threat that presents itself? Certainly, Freud notes the puzzling and apparently contradictory nature of acts of preservative self-assertion against harsh externals that might grant the organism readily the suicide it ultimately seeks. Hence arises, he writes, quote, "the paradoxical situation that the living organism struggles most energetically against events, dangers in fact, which might help it to attain its life's aim rapidly by a kind of short circuit," end quote. Yet if it is the case that every living organism wishes not simply to die by any means necessary and via the quickest route possible, but rather in a way and at a pace comporting with what we might call its inherent narcissism, then all external events, accidents, natural struggles, and social entanglements become so many diversions from the final goal. The instincts of self-preservation and the accompanying expressions of heteroaggressivity are thus subordinated to what will become a drive toward death, the infamous death drive, always uniquely expressed. The ultimate end, then, is not death, but every ego's own death, not just any death that may befall us, but our own deaths, deaths insofar as we may fashion them in our collective circumstances, out of our milieu. Quoting Freud, quote, "Seen in this light, the theoretical importance of the instincts of self-preservation, of self-assertion, and of mastery greatly diminishes. They are component instincts whose function it is to assure that the organism shall follow its own path to death, and to ward off any possible ways of returning to inorganic existence other than those which are immanent in the organism itself. What we are left with," Freud concludes, "is the fact that the organism wishes to die only in its own fashion," end quote. Dying, narcissistically reworked, thus orients life. Killing ourselves becomes the project of living. And it may be, I want to suggest, a project of living together, a project that allows the exceeding of determination and the persistence of indetermination that Miguel Abensur, extending some formulations by Claude Lefort, called savage or wild democracy, démocratie sauvage. The savage essence of democracy, Abensur maintains, quote, "forces democracy as a symbolic form to leave the field open for an experience of indetermination, for an experience of the loss of foundations," end quote. Consequently, savage democracy exceeds the very institutions through which democracy manifests and maintains itself as a form. Speculating on Abensur's insight, I want to say that a democratic reconciliation with the death drive, a democratic reconciliation in the death drive after the announcement of the ends of man, would not be an all too determinate killing of others, nor the killing of ourselves by way of others. Not we are killing, and not we are being killed. Nor would it be a biopolitical fostering of life, the same biopolitical fostering of life that Mireles and Pozuelo advance with their dogged, reductive focus on the survival of unknown peoples. A savage democratic approach to death would allow the exceeding of determination and the persistence of indetermination that, as we have seen, really constitutes rule, self-rule by the people. It would hover, in other words, between we are being killed by ourselves and we foster death because we die for ourselves. It would hover between the reflexive masochism that closely tracks our sexual constitution and the fantasy of death in the middle voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Vamos ouvir agora Juan Obarrio.
Vamos ouvir Juan Obarrio com seus comentários.
Thank you. These are two very substantial papers. I think there's a lot for discussion, so I want to pick up on a couple of points that resonate between the two papers, and then a very brief proposition. Something that the two papers share is this common concern with savage politics, a horizon of a savage imaginary on the one hand. On the other hand, the prevalence, the centrality of violence within democracy. And if we are discussing the ends of democracy or crisis of democracy, these essays and presentations are highlighting how much of that crisis is produced through the effect and the actions of violence within democracy. Which takes us to another debate that I want to mention, but I won't develop, which is the problem of immunity. How much democracy has to immunize itself through the negative, or in this case, through violence, or how much conflict can democracy assimilate in order to immunize itself and keep moving on. In the case of one of the essays, we have the violence of genocide or slow genocide and political violence. In the other essay, what is most highlighted is what I would refer to as the violence of abstraction. And following these two papers, I would like to claim that, propose that a big part of our current crisis of democracy is precisely produced by the unfolding and the deepening of the violence of abstraction. The papers also notice, particularly Monique's papers, also note that things have returned with a vengeance, that any discussion on our political present is also a discussion on things. As I was rereading the essays, I'm reminded that some of the most virulent political actions throughout the world today have to do with tearing down big pieces of cement and sculpted rock throughout the world, particularly in the US. We know what's been happening with statues from the Confederacy period, but also in Budapest recently the Hungarian government tore down a statue of György Lukács that was placed in the central square. Returns of things with a vengeance. And part of our current crisis of democracy, I think the papers are arguing, the older debate put it in terms of a crisis of the link between words and things, between signifiers and its referent. These essays are saying that the crisis is also the crisis between the relation between subjects and objects, between persons and things, or persons that become things. Another common thread through both papers, which are very different, but I'm trying to find some resonances, has to do with knowledge, particularly with savage knowledge and with unconscious knowledge. And then the key political issue that has to do with the fact of what it is possible to know, what it is impossible to know, what we cannot know, the key centrality of these two things for democracy, and a third, much more subtle variation of that, which is what we know that we are not supposed to know, what circulates as unconscious knowledge in between publicity and secrecy. And this Jimmy brings up very forcefully at the beginning of the essay with the question of unknown knowledge, unknown peoples that are unknown, but also he has this key mention of what one of the persons dealing with this kind of people said, something along the lines of, they do not know that we are here to save them or rescue them, and so on. And I wanted to, as a provocation, to push that point further isn't that at the core center of the populist movements as well? That the people, or at least that share of the people that is being articulated, they do not know that we are here to articulate them within the populist project, and that is a constitutive core link. Another key point that I want to touch upon, the question of agency and passivity, and going back to Rousseau, and then Lyotard. Jimmy mentions the split between citizen and subject as a split between agency and passivity, but also the split between the sovereign and the state would be this inert, passive apparatus, which reminds us, going back to things and to the return of things, that what we consider now the state as the main political actor was not always exactly what we have in front of us today. At some point in the 15th century, in the 16th century, there was this political sleight of hand that took place, and what was considered precisely a state of things, a condition, or the state of the prince, became an actual concrete object, a state apparatus. And I want to argue, deepening what the papers just presented to us, that a big part of the crisis of democracy today has to do with that sleight of hand, that fetishization of political conditions and temporal conditions into a thing, the fetish of the state apparatus. That concretization, materialization of the political into an object also has produced what with Monique we could call phantasmagorias of liberal democracy. All these spurious divisions between, juridical divisions, between private and public, certainly between state and civil society, between citizen and subject. I would like to argue that these are fallacies, but living through these fallacies, we arrive at the crisis of democracy that we are facing today. Crisis of democracy, I want to anticipate my main point, that is also being brought upon itself by liberal democracy. It's not just external threats and external forces of, say, authoritarianism or fascism, but internal contradictions, paradoxes, and deficits of the liberal model of democracy that is being presented as the hegemonic or probably unique model that is possible. The other spurious juridical distinction between citizen and subject, something that we can call, with Kantorowicz, who studied the state, but we can refer to the citizen as the citizen's two bodies. In the same way as the state and the king had a material and an abstract body, the citizen within our democratic systems also possesses two bodies, a concrete body of the flesh, singular body or persona, but also incarnates a more abstract, universal, ideal citizen. And there's a huge political problem that also lies in the critical predicament of democracy today. That abstract citizen, that universal citizen is inserted in a series of equivalents. Is replaceable, is comparable, is displaceable, and so on and so forth. Of course, it has been recently Etienne Balibar who has most forcefully developed the question of the citizen subject and how the previous subject returns within the modern citizen, the subjected individual, or the individual objectified, materialized as a thing, as an object that can be used, return in the juridical modern citizen that is supposed to be, on the one hand, a proprietor, and modernity equates citizenship with private property, as Monique told us in the paper. On the other hand, the citizen also possesses itself. The modern subject citizen has to be self-possessed. There's a split there between an individual persona that is both citizen and subject and object. And from that to Jimmy's quote of Wendy Brown's foundation of democracy as a people who possesses itself and therefore can rule itself. We rule ourselves because we possess ourselves. I want to emphasize this is very well known, but it's at the core of the crisis that we are discussing, the split, the gap that opens up in modern political philosophy between people lowercase and people capital P uppercase, or more specifically, the problem between the part and the whole. A share of the people that becomes an equivalent of the whole of the people. And here it is more for Jimmy as a question provocation. You were speaking about parts of the people that are being expelled, sacrificed, killed, murdered in genocide. I was reminded of Bataille's The Accursed Share. These people with lowercase p is sacrificed as an accursed share. What is the relationship between that gap, people that is sacrificed in order for the people to be constituted, and the other one I just referred to, the constitutive problem of democratic popular sovereignty, if you want, between a share of the people who has to become the totality. There are two ways, at least, two main ways to mind that gap, to fill that gap. One is the liberal democratic way, through mediations and representations. The other one is the populist way. And I would like to argue that populism is an insurgency against mediation. It's a political rebellion against liberal systems of mediation and representation, or how to fill that gap between the part and the whole, the people and the totality of the people, in a more direct way, or unmediated way. Jimmy had this very suggestive reference to the middle form. And you said, quoting Laplanche, in the middle form, fantasy remains in a state of coalescence. I think that is what we are encountering today as the crisis of democracy. What always was understood as a state of things, as a fluid political condition that where you had a coalescence between public and private interests and other fields that are actually combined and mingled, and juridical fiat artificially presents as separate. I think in our present crisis of democracy, the state is in a fantasy. The state is a state of coalescence, or as we say in the US today, of collusion. Separate, artificially demarcated and separated by what Monique was referring to as the phantasmagoria of the juridical, of the abstraction of the juridical. Let me go quickly through a couple of final points. What I just referred to briefly as the violence of abstraction, this has always been with us. If we equate modern liberal democracy with capitalist democracy and capitalism, only that in the last 2 to 3 decades, the hegemony of financial capital has made this violence of abstraction quasi-absolute. The absolutization of abstraction, the dematerialization of the social. In more ethnographic terms, what we observe is an imaginary of distance, not only of abstraction, but the hegemony of finance produces distance and absolute mediation. That is undermining all systems of legitimacy for modern liberal democracies. The creation of this abstract distance between citizens and the locus of sovereign power. Again, populism, populist insurgency goes against this abstraction, mediation, representation, ruling by identification and demarcation of identities, the erasure of materiality, of depth, and the texture of both the body and the body politic. An erasure that also erodes historical time, and the distinction that Monique brings up between the materiality of simple things or things at hand and socially alienated things constructed in the phantasmagoria of the social. But a provocation for Monique before I conclude, or a question to go further. You quote, as other people do today, Walter Benjamin and mechanical reproduction. And that is also a metaphor for democracy, because the citizen is inserted in this series of equivalences and reproduction. I think with what is happening with the hegemony of finance, more specifically of digital finance, that even the Benjaminian model has become obsolete. It's an absolute erasure of the depth of history and of origins, and even the decayed aura that the copy had after the end of the original, that is also gone. That for the kind of objects you were referring to, I think it's an analogy that can be also transferred to the crisis of democracy, the figure of this democratic citizen is becoming obsolete in the absolutization of abstraction, in the absolute reproduction of digital copies of simulacra, basically. So, to conclude, a call to arms, a small call to arms provocation. Your papers allowed me to rephrase Gramsci, maybe, pessimism of the mind, animism of the will. Can we think about a new form of animism? I am an anthropologist, but I'm very, very skeptical about the sources that were being quoted today as animism of the other, the non-Western subject. But can we imagine another type of animism that re-enchants, that reanimates, that rematerializes, and that closes the gaps and the abstractions created by the regulations of liberal democracy? An animism that would emancipate both subjects and objects, persons and things, as I think was also the call by Vladimir yesterday. Surprisingly, we heard a lot about animism, but not so much about fetishism and fetishization, which is the main force of this violence of abstraction. Finally, a new animism, a new re-enchantment, it would produce, hopefully, a new type of democratic individual beyond citizen and subject, beyond citizen, which is the biopolitical figure of property, citizen equals proprietor, beyond the subject of the object of genocide or of necropolitics, beyond both the violence of abstraction and the violence of deathly political violence. Thank you.
Monique, 7 minutes.
Monique, você tem 7 minutos.
So I have 2 points. Perhaps it's the same, but naturally when I began to work on this relation between will and thing, I have in the background the problem of fetishism of commodities. And my question is it only in the capitalist system that there is an opacity of sins, of social sins? And the other question, so it's a beginning, I have not the solution. The other question is, if we face the violence in society, in capitalism or in the violent fantasy of murder, as Jimmy describes, can property property be useful to transform that or not? And at the beginning, I thought that possibly the property imprisons the violence in things. But now I think no. It's not our system of property doesn't have the capacity to transform the violence in the same, the term of violence, it's too general. I think to violence and civility by Balibar. That is to say, Balibar says we cannot put an end at any violence, but the political is to find dispositive and institution to separate what he calls ultra-objective violence and ultra-subjective violence. And my problem is property, this system or another, capable to introduce such a distance? And so I will ask Jimmy, the propension of democracy to ignore the phantasm of murder. Would you put this in a close relation with Balibar's analysis of the subjective ultra-violence, the ultra-subjective violence? That is to say, this level where there is no difference between subject and the person who is murdered. This, for example, it's also what Melanie Klein described, but in the social. Would you say that the capacity of we people to make genocide has to do with this analysis of subjective-objective violence?
split within we the people is that there is what I think the former president of the United States, Richard Nixon, once called a plausible deniability, right? I think the fact that I can plausibly deny that I actually want these people murdered, I as citizen can plausibly deny that I actually want this murder, I as subject can plausibly deny that I want this murder, right? Both the subject and the object can, what's interesting about the fantasy is that it's possible to switch positions. Oh, it wasn't me who actually wanted this. I didn't really desire this, right? So I'm interested in the way in which within this fantasy that I'm trying to, this sort of fantasy of death that I'm trying to think, fantasy of killing and murder that I'm trying to think through, that there is a way in which it's precisely what Juan called the citizen's two bodies, is what allows this rather violent form of indeterminacy, right? So what I ultimately want to rescue is a fantasy of indeterminacy that is very different from that, that is not murderous, that is not about enacting a death drive on other people, but following one's own, following a collective understanding of what is it that, how is it that we would want to die well, rather than how would we want to murder. So I think it's the indeterminacy that allows for a whole series of alibis about, you get this in Brazil, right? Of course, I don't believe that, I as a citizen who lives in, whatever fancy neighborhood of Sao Paulo, of course I don't want, my fellow citizens who are Afro-descendants to be killed in the streets, right? You say that consciously, but what are the unconscious alibis for a desire for this kind of murder? That's what I'm trying to think through. There's an indeterminacy that I think, there are a few indeterminacies, and I'm trying to identify one of them as particularly murderous, and trying to think through a different kind of indeterminacy that would not submit to that kind of alibi for murder.
Questões, então, agora de vocês. Acho que a gente tem o microfone andando, né? Quem gostaria de colocar uma pergunta? Judith.
Posso perguntar em português? Eu tenho uma pergunta para o Jimmy.
I have a question for Jimmy about
essa sua investigação,
this
digamos assim, sobre
investigation,
uma certa disposição psíquica para matar.
Psychological
O que você
disposition to
pensaria
kill.
sobre
What do you
versões
think
menos
about
passionais, digamos
less
assim,
passional
que
versions
condicionam essa
that
disposição para
condition
matar?
this
Eu penso, por
willingness,
exemplo,
disposition to kill.
num trabalho que tem sido feito em torno do conceito de trabalho sujo
that has been
e
conducted regarding the concept of dirty work and rescuing the souls, the idea of social justice banalization and reflecting with Eichmann of Arendt.
Me vem à cabeça também, por exemplo,
it also comes to my mind the recent study by
pesquisador
a
francês sobre o
French
drone
researcher regarding
e
drones
sobre como que
and
o
about
funcionamento psíquico
the
dos operadores de
psychic
drone,
functioning
também
of
de
the
uma forma
drones operators.
Que acho que nesse caso não se aplicaria sadismo, mas sim
maybe not a sadism, but a
absoluto,
distancing, a total distancing.
The drone question is very
A pergunta sobre o drone é muito
in the comments that I was making yesterday as the Obarrio in the first panel, I was referring to bureaucratic homicide. I think this is actually a particularly interesting example of and I am as well, of a kind of participation in democratic murder, where you really can't have the alibi of being a passive subject. I'm just following
Yes, thank you. I find it interesting that both, with reference to violence and what can be done about violence, and they also both reference Freud, although I think that in the end, Monique refers to civilization and its discontents, and you focus more on beyond the pleasure principle. And I point that out because it seems to me that the death drive the formulation of the death drive in beyond the pleasure principle is the one that you very clearly articulate, which has to do with an effort to return to a preeminent, an inanimate state. And yet the death drive in civilization and its discontents starts to really develop more explicitly the idea of a kind of destructiveness that serves no libidinal aim. That is to say, that is not linked with a satisfaction that we can understand as a libidinal satisfaction. So I have, I want to make one comment about that, and then I have two questions. The one comment I want to make about the second version of the death drive is that its automatic, its unconquerable and repetitive, compulsively repetitive character is linked to Freud's reflections on technology and technological destruction. So although it's part of human, a human drive, a tree, the death drive, it is also described through a mechanical and technocratic language that fuses the human and the technological in a way that is absolutely terrifying and leads to the potential of genocide, which he does strangely mention in 1930, when you would think that thought would not yet be fully materialized. So that's just one thought, but here this is the two questions. Monique, at the very end of your paper, you remind us that Freud says that communism will not take care of the problem of aggression, that if we abolish private property, that will not abolish aggression. Aggression has a separate track. It's not produced by property relations. And you also have asked the question of whether objects, rituals, and institutions, which are not necessarily property relations, right? They're not property relations. Objects, rituals, and institutions allow us to transform violence. And you've opened up another relation to the author's works. And you've talked really interesting, and it's not a property relation. It is not property relations. Does that violence, and if so, the question I have for Jimmy is that I'm made nervous by the fact that you're talking about tribal peoples who remain nameless for those who would save them. The one you take from Miguel Sir. Sauvage is also savage. So the savage returns the second time in the second, and then the question for you becomes how does. And I'm just wondering, is the tribe in the savage that you identify with the death, or have you moved from savage to sauvage? Have you moved have you decided to use savagery, which is associated with the tribal, as a way of figuring the death drive? Is that pre-modern? Is it? How do we handle that slippage in the work? I'm just made a little bit nervous by it, and of course, the second part of that question is this: you ask a perfectly good question, whether democracy can be reconciled with the death drive, but isn't the death drive precisely that with which no reconciliation is possible? If it's unconquerable, if it deconstitutes our efforts at reconciliation, perhaps that's not the question we ask about the death drive. Maybe it is the limit of every reconciliation.
So, thank you, Judith, for your question. It's true that my reference is more in this paper with civilization and its discontent, and I wasn't satisfied by the sentence of Freud when he said that to destroy the private property, do not put an end to violence, to aggressivity between humans. But after, it's not, because it could be read as a defense of property. It's too short in order to know how we must hear this proposition in Freud. And I try to open then other dispositive of property. This is my aim on one hand. And possibly also, yes, it's too quickly said by Freud. But on the other hand, it's true that this question of property and of things do have to do with behind of pleasure principle. As I said at the end, I find that this insistence of how all the, by Hegel, on how all the social relation, all the social struggle have in a moment are not replaced, no, pas remplacés, not have a moment in things. For example, there is something material here in a house of culture without the organization, a certain organization of space, and materials, and we cannot work together. So for each social institution or creation, he said that there is a singular materialization of relation. It's not exactly a theater, it's not a church, and so on. So there are many, many kinds of materiality because each activity of social agents creates something through materiality. So my question on property then was, is that a good dispositif to transform death drive or not. I was perhaps I am too confident to the theme of object and materiality, but if we can go out the limit of the representative conception of democracy, it is because democracy is not only a question in representation. Democracy is also a dispositive with a materiality. Perhaps in the dispositive sense Foucault, there is also an insistence on materiality. It's not the same materiality than in Hegel, but there is an agencement, a materiality of something social, and social even if it's language. And then we are a mode of thinking our world totally different than the democratic principle. So, but if materiality is very important and in new way, and the only one who said that very precisely is Hegel, I mean, if there is the case, then what new image of our democracy must we have? Must we develop? How are we such in such incapacity to see where we live, where we are living? What is the basis of our relations? That was my question. And it's true that, just one word on death drive, because we worked with many people here on that, that question. You said you analyzed the detour to the death drives, and you said each supposedly organism or each human being in the desire has to aim not directly to the death, but his own death. Yes, but this own death, Freud said, is only possible, and the detour, by contingent factor. It's narcissistic and non-narcissistic. And I had the impression that you insist l'éloge des hasards dans la vie sexuelle, who make
a moment during the planning for this, where and I think when I had suggested savage democracy as the translation of démocratie sauvage, and you had said, do you intend for it to say savage rather than wild? And I English translator uses savage, but also because of the signifier here. That, let's see what to say here. The final three positions in those as, you know, sort of separate entities. But I would say about whether the death drive is precisely that which we cannot reconcile ourselves that with which we cannot reconcile ourselves. Can we think about a possible super-ego relation in favor of superego structures are this and they need to do that, way that God in negative theology is imagined as not having particular attributes, but as being able, in terms of its effects, the limit of reconciliation. I guess what I want to suggest is it possible to negate other sets of relations within the psychological, within a psychic, metapsychological structure in order to allow greater play for the id-ego relation. And so one of Laplanche's essays is called The Death Drive, a Sexual Drive. So how can we imagine sexuality, for example, as a field of activity for allowing this greater play of id-ego relations, and not so much, and as a way perhaps to deaccumulate, to use a term that Rahel gave us yesterday, deaccumulate superego relations. And again, this is not something that can consciously be done, but I want to speculate on the possibility of what it might be like to negate or move away from a set of structures that might have murderous effects. And then in terms of what Monique brought up of my own death and the fact that it's contingent, this I think is exactly what I want to open up, right? Because I think it's possible to think, oh, death drive, I must have a particular destination, right? My death is this particular destination. But one can be led to one's own death in a variety of ways. So I want to sort of open the idea to a range of possible deaths, not a particular destination. So it's not narcissistic and individualistic in the sense of, this is my death, this is the death that I should have, but rather, a field of possibilities of dying well within a particular cultural and historical moment. So that's what I am trying to think through.
Bom, vamos ter que encerrar a mesa, então. Queria agradecer as
Unfortunately, we
perguntas.
have to wrap up.